Hello. So in this video we're gonna focus a little bit more on these neural impulses. I know they can be confusing, so this is gonna be a shorter video, but going over exactly what's happening with these neural impulses once again. And so in the intro to chapter 3, we talked specifically about this image here, about what's happening during the neural impulse. So we're going to do a short kind of review of that, and then we're going to talk about why things happen like that. So again, this first image, then we're talking about what the cell looks like at rest. So this is called the resting potential, is at negative 70 millivolts. And so at rest, it's at negative 70 because we have a negative charge inside, positive charge outside. Sodium is outside the cell, potassium is inside the cell. All channels are closed. Then during an action potential, then we get an opening of the sodium channels. Sodium floods into the cell, causing the cell potential to become positive, and then we get an action potential when it becomes negative 40 millivolts. So the potassium channels are still closed, sodium floods into the cell, more positive inside, more negative outside the cell. Then after an action potential, when the cell inside becomes positive, it causes the potassium channels to open, causing a flood of potassium outside the cell. What this does is it recharges the cell so that again we have negative inside the cell, positive outside the cell. This will cause the cell to go back to its resting potential. Here's a graph of the voltage of the cell membrane. So we've got our resting potential at negative 70. Sodium channels open, sodium flows into the cell, and we go up to positive 40. This is called an action potential. Then, because it's positive, it causes these potassium channels to open. So potassium flows out of the cell, making the cell more negative again. We get this refractory period, but the cell goes back to its resting potential of negative 70. So now, why does this happen? So the first thing you need to think about is that an action potential is all or none. Okay, so an action potential occurs at a uniform and maximum intensity, or they do not occur at all. In other words, the action potential has a threshold. So you need to have enough sodium ions flood into the cell in order for all of the sodium channels to open up and cause a full action potential. So you can have maybe a leaky channel, or maybe just a few channels open, and it can cause sodium to come into the cell. But unless we get to the threshold, then you're not going to get an action potential. And if we don't have an action potential, it's not going to cause the cascade of potential down the axon. So in other words, that electrical signal is going to stop right there. And that's not what you want. So the action potential threshold is at about negative 50. In other words, you only need enough sodium ions to get that 20 millivolt change in order to reach that threshold. So the threshold's pretty low, but you still need to meet that threshold in order to get an action potential. So what that means is that a stronger signal does not cause a stronger action potential. You either have an action potential or you don't. Okay? So you can create more action potentials. In other words, you can increase the rate at which the cell is firing, but you can't change the intensity of an action potential. So sodium and potassium must enter and leave the axon at the correct rate in order for the action potential to occur. Now, you can affect this based on some drugs can affect the rate at which the cell fires, such as like Novocaine, for instance, can slow down firing because it actually attaches to the sodium channels and doesn't let the sodium channels or sodium ions into the cell, therefore stopping the firing of neurons. You can also change the rate of firing by changing the refractory period. So again, if we look back to this figure, we're going to focus on this graph here. So this action potential, so we have rest is negative 70. And really what it should show is that you have a slow increase of sodium ions to about negative 50. So that'd be about here. You'd have a slow increase, and then it would cause this big jump. Okay, so let's see if I can draw. I'm going to draw, so it should be more like that. Okay, so you should be negative 70. You get a slow increase of sodium until this, which we'll say is negative 50. And then that's where you get the big jump up to the action potential because we reached that threshold. Okay? So that's how that action potential would really look like. Now, I was talking about how we can, you can't increase the intensity of an action potential. You can change the rate at which you can do that. And one thing that really dictates the rate is this refractory period, which is this section right here that's below this line. So anything that's below negative 70, which is that resting potential, this is what prevents the cell from being able to fire again. And so this is what we call hyperpolarization. In other words, it's too negative. And so what's happening there? So that's our absolute refractory period. So during this time, the cell can't fire again, which limits how often the nerve impulses can occur. And so you can think of this as a refractory period of, we have refractory periods in other aspects of life. I'm sure you can extrapolate that to what I'm talking about. But what this does is it ensures that impulses only travel in a single direction. In other words, it makes sure that we don't have potassium flowing into the cell or sodium flowing out of the cell, because that's not the way it's supposed to work. It also makes sure that the action potential goes from the soma to the axon terminals and not the other way around. So we only want the action potential traveling down the axon, not up the axon. So without the refractory period, the action potential could travel both ways, and we don't want that. So again, if we look at the action potential, or the resting period here, I've lost my drawing tool. Here, again, that's anything below here. What we can do is you can train the cell, and you can actually limit it so that the resting period looks more like that, so it recovers quicker. So that is a possibility, and we'll talk about that later in the course, but pretty much by the more you use a cell, the shorter the refractory period will be because it's more in demand. So for a cell that you don't use very often, then you're going to have a longer recovery period. So you can also think about that as when you use your muscles, then muscles you use all the time, you don't get sore after using them, right? because you have a shorter refractory period. But cells or muscles you don't use very often, so you go to the gym and now you're using muscles you haven't used before, you're going to be sore the next day. You're going to, it's going to be harder to use those muscles again because you have a longer refractory period because you're not using them as often. So the same thing happens with neurons. Another thing that we can use is a myelin sheath. And so myelin sheaths, while they also insulate the cell, then they also have a great importance in helping the cell with moving this action potential from the soma to the axon terminals. So the myelin sheath is really like a whitish insulation layer made up of glial cells. And what it does is it kind of acts like plastic insulation on an electrical wire. So the myelin sheath isn't completely formed until after birth, which is why infants will gain muscular coordination and the ability to walk as they grow older, because they don't have this insulation, they don't have these helper cells as much. So older people have more myelin sheaths due to really using these cells more. And unfortunately, people that have MS, so multiple sclerosis, what that is it's a damage to the myelin coating. And what that does is it results in jerky, uncoordinated movements, and sometimes even paralysis because the cell isn't insulated anymore. It doesn't have the support around the neuron, so it can't fire correctly. Now, in between the myelin sheaths, then we have what's called the nodes of Ranvier. Again, my favorite part of the cell. And the nodes of Ranvier is, again, these little spaces in between the myelin sheaths, and it allows the action potential to skip ahead, which leads to faster signaling, which means you get a faster signal from the beginning of the cell to the end of the cell, which again will then allow the cell to fire a second time quicker because you don't have to wait for the signal to get all the way to the axon terminals in order to get another signal going. You can start a lot quicker. So pretty much what it's doing is it's kind of like, think of a game of catch. You can either have 100 people lined up shoulder to shoulder and pass a ball one to the other all the way down a football field, or you can have, say, 10 people lined up along the field with spaces in between them and toss the ball from one to the other down the field. Now, which ball is going to get to the end quicker? Obviously, the one where people are throwing it larger distances quicker, rather than having to have 100 people pass it one-to-one all the way down. That can take a time. Of course, this is assuming people are good at catching. But this is what really helps the cell get that signaling a lot quicker. So again, if we go back to, say, this image, then so we'll still have this part of the cell firing, but say this second portion here will be covered by myelin sheath. So what you're going to do is you're actually going to skip it. So I'm going to draw again. So we'll say here. We have a line here, so that's a section. This is a section. So pretty much we're going to cover this section in our myelin sheath, and now the potential just has to jump over it, which means less of the axon needs to go through this entire process. So again, if we kind of draw like here, this section is going to stick at resting potential the whole time, and this is going to jump over to there. Okay, does that make sense? I hope so. Okay, so instead of that, then we have that, and this action potential is going to jump over there. So again, it's causing the cell to be able to send that information quicker. So that's really all I have for this review of how nerve impulses work. But there is this really great video if you want some more information. I would highly recommend it. And then on Wednesday, we're going to talk about how information is passed from one cell to another. So this was how information is kind of passed within a cell. Next time, we're going to talk about between cells.